in Washington, D.C.
Tonight, Capitol Hill rebuke. The Republican-led Senate votes to limit President Trump's war powers on Iran. A symbolic move for now, with an interim peace deal still in effect, but a striking rebuke from members of the president's own party. We'll discuss with Democratic Senator Angela Alsobrooks and Republican Senator Roger Marshall this hour. And on the road, the president trying to turn the page today with an event in Pennsylvania. His first major speech outside D.C. since signing the MOU to end the war with Iran. The White House trying to pull the focus now back to affordability as the midterms close in. And primary day in America. Once again, voters heading to the polls, this time in New York, Maryland, and Utah, with a series of races testing both parties ahead of November. In New York, Mayor Mamdani's influence is on the ballot as his endorsed candidates try to reshape the city's Democratic delegation. And for Republicans, key contests will offer another read on the party's direction in the Trump era. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons.
And, Joe, we begin with the Republican-controlled Senate, as you mentioned, delivering a significant rebuke to President Trump over the Iran war. 4 Republicans voting to pass the war powers resolution with Democrats 50-48. The measure, which cleared the House earlier this month and is mostly symbolic, was gavelled just as Trump was on stage in Pennsylvania as part of his affordability tour, and one day before, he's set to join Senate Republicans for lunch on Capitol Hill. And joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisko, who's here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. So, Michelle, a war powers resolution finally passes both chambers. The House, of course, passed this resolution first. What's the consequence, knowing that we're already in the middle of negotiations with Iran?
Well, you're right, Kaylee. I mean, you said it. It's symbolic, but it is a rebuke. It's a significant rebuke of the president's agenda, of his conduct in the war and the aftermath, as they see it, of the conflict. So we'll have to see from here, but certainly a sign of the rising domestic pressure to end this for real. I mean, we're in this kind of limbo period. We're only a few days into the 60-day MOU period. With still a lot of questions unanswered and some startling discrepancies that have come about in recent days about what the U.S. and Iran feel are their interpretations of the agreement they signed last week.
So let's talk about that. Michelle, it seems like both countries were at different tables at some point when it comes to weapons inspectors. The U.S. says they will imminently arrive in Iran. Iran says they're not welcome. And I could draw several other examples here, reminding us of the fact that there is not a second round of talks scheduled, is there?
Well, no, not as now as we know it. Of course, the U.S. side has said that Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff will remain involved in the technical discussions. Mm-hmm. But as of today, we had the Iranian and Pakistani delegations meeting in Pakistan and sharing a stage for a press conference in which one of those discrepancies came up, at least in reports that ballistic missile program issues might be discussed. They pushed back hard on that. Pakistan, speaking for Iran, said, look, that's not the case. And Iran also voicing their own opinion that the ballistic missile program is not up for negotiation at all. So that kind of cut against some of the rhetoric that we've heard from the U.S. side as well as other reports. Mm-hmm. But probably more glaringly, Joe, today we were focused on the unfrozen funds, Iran's assets that are going to be returned to them from the U.S. Via the U.S. and Trump's claims that seem to be quite a bit at odds with how Iran is interpreting things, where Trump and U.S. officials have said those funds will only be used for food and medical supplies to be purchased from the U.S. And are remaining in an escrow fund until they will be used for that purpose. And Iran coming back and saying pretty clearly, Foreign Ministry spokesman saying that's not the case at all. We will use them for whatever we would like, and we will get them cash up front. So it's very hard to kind of unpack exactly where they are in those technical discussions. Now, the U.S. has said it's hard to negotiate with Iran. They say one thing behind the scenes and another thing in state media and other press. On the other side, we've had discrepancies even within the U.S. administration between Trump and Vance and other officials.
Wow.
All right. It's a lot to keep track of. Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisko. Thank you so much. And joining us now for more on that war powers vote and other subjects is Democratic Senator Angela Alsobrooks of Maryland, a member of the Senate Banking, Housing and Urban Affairs Committee and the Senate Health committee as well. Senator, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. We appreciate you joining us, understanding that you, along with almost all of your Democratic colleagues other than Senator Fetterman and 4 Republicans, did just vote to pass this war powers resolution that would direct the U.S. to stop hostilities against Iran without congressional approval. The hostilities, Senator, already have stopped. We're in the middle of an extended ceasefire pursuing a negotiated deal. Is the president and this administration not taking your preferred course of action here?
Well, I mean, the thing now, this is a very significant vote that occurred today. It essentially requires the president to remove our troops now from this conflict. It also highlights what I think all Americans know who are watching this, is that this war in Iran is an unmitigated disaster for the United States of America. It is plain for all to see that Iran now has been left better off, as you mentioned here in your own broadcast. They now have their assets unfrozen, but America has been left worse off. Not only are we less safe, there is no deal, as you mentioned. What the United States essentially agreed to was, we'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. A discussion that we're waiting for regarding Iran's nuclear program never happened. And so this president took us into a war as a country without a plan and an agenda, without a rationale for going in, and certainly now cannot come to the American people and say that we are better off. Americans footed the struggle. We have now, the cost of this war has been borne by working class people in our country who cannot afford the cost of gas, who cannot afford the cost of groceries. We've seen escalating utility costs. Everything about this disastrous war cost Americans and left Iran better off. It's horrific. It really is unconscionable what this president has done.
Well, I see, Senator, you're paying $3.81 on average for a gallon of regular gas in the state of Maryland, which is below the national average of $3.92. But just to add to Kayleigh's question and to clarify, is the purpose of this war powers exercise suggesting that you think that this war is not over, that President Trump could indeed resume military activity in the Middle East?
Well, because the president is so erratic and we can't know from one day to the next. I mean, they say the war is over, then the war isn't over. What it instructs, it now sends a very clear message to the president that he ought to abide by, is that this war now, any further action will be done illegally, because both houses, the House and the Senate, have now said that we now must remove America from this conflict, that we can no longer continue the conflict. So that's what it does. Is it asserts the power of the Congress, which is our power to start, that this is an unauthorized exercise.
Well, and now there is a bicameral agreement on this. The House passed this resolution first. Obviously, the Senate just did so as well. It's reverse for the 21st Century Road to Housing Act, which you and your colleagues have already passed, and now will face a vote in the House as soon as tonight. This was a massive bipartisan majority that we don't see often in Washington anymore, Senator, to address housing affordability specifically. Are there more bipartisan affordability legislative efforts targeting affordability opportunities out there, or is the moment passing as the midterms get closer?
Well, you know what, I think what this proves is that there are many more opportunities for us to work in a bipartisan fashion and to do what the American people sent us here to do. You know, when my parents married at 21 and 22 years old as a receptionist and a car salesman, they could afford to buy a modest home within 5 years of that marriage. The average age of a first-time home buyer in our country right now is 40 years old. So the road to housing is a really important piece of legislation that now will help us to not only increase the housing stock in our country, but the pieces of the legislation that I worked on are ones that will give banks additional leverage now and additional opportunity to invest in affordable housing. It allows people to make repairs to their homes, people who have modest incomes to make repairs to their homes so that they are not foreclosed upon. It allows appraisal bias to be addressed as an issue. And so this is hugely important for people like my 21-year-old daughter, who are all concerned. If you go from one part of my state to the next, and all across the country. The cost of housing is a real concern, and our children don't believe they'll be able to live even as well as their parents. But this is a bipartisan effort. I think it is so important to demonstrate that we are able to get hard things done and to do so on a bipartisan way that address the affordability crisis that we see in our country right now, and to address what Americans want us to be focused on, and that's their kitchen tables. How can they afford the cost of living?
I think we're similar age, from what I understand, Senator. And I believe our parents were paying something around 12% mortgage rates at the time, too. But I want to ask you about another important issue I know to you, as you helped to negotiate a deal to advance the Clarity Act. Let's talk about crypto for a moment, because when we spoke at the Milken conference in Los Angeles weeks ago, the talk was about a recently cut deal involving stablecoin yield. There is now a big question about ethics when it comes to advancing the Clarity Act, and whether there should be legislative language that, for instance, prevents the Trump family from enriching itself in this sector, one that it is already deeply involved in. Will you attempt to cut another deal, this time involving ethics in crypto?
Well, you know what? This is an ongoing effort. As you've mentioned, we have language on yield, which is the part of the bill that I have worked on. But let me just be abundantly clear. I will not support on the floor any legislation that does not address ethics and that does not address illicit finance. These conversations have been happening. It's going to be especially important to have the Department of Justice agree that they are going to enforce these ethics laws. And if they do not, then the states ought to have the right to sue. This is basic language that the White House agreed to and that my Republican colleagues put on, and then they have withdrawn that language. And so we got to make sure that we are at that table in a very serious way. I believe that this innovation should grow. We want innovation to grow in our country, and we want the United States to be a leader in digital assets. We're in the middle of a digital revolution, but we have to do so in a responsible way that does not allow scams and fraud to happen to our to constituents. So innovation should grow, but the United States should be a leader in how we do it responsibly, and having ethics and illicit finance and doing work on that ag committee is going to be really important to getting this across the finish line. And so I urge everybody to stay at the table. I think we can get this done, but ethics and illicit finance absolutely must be addressed.
Well, as you talk about responsibility, Senator, is it not irresponsible to risk not having market structure legislation that would firmly guide the regulation of this industry past this Congress over concerns about the president's family and the like?
Well, that's the reason I've been at the table. I do have an obligation. I believe that it is my job to be at the table to make sure we have these guardrails in place. It's the reason that we've done a lot of hard work over the last 9 or 10 months to make sure that we regulate an industry that, by the way, is currently unregulated. So this is going to be really important. It's the reason that I'm at the table. But it does mean that while we're there, we're going to have ethics and illicit finance. That's what the people of my state demand. It's what the people of our country demand, is that we make it safe for people to participate in this innovation that I think is going to be really important. But you're right. I have a role, and that's the reason that I'm at the table. If you're not there, you don't get anything.
How do you thread the needle on this, then? I understand. How do you thread the needle on this, Senator? Do you name the executive? Do you name the Trump family, knowing that he needs to sign this for it to become law?
Well, I think that elected officials, it's the president, vice president, and all elected officials ought to be prohibited from there's specific language there. But it applies to all of us, those of us in Congress as well. And I think this is a reasonable language. It's one, again, that we've been working back and forth. So we will continue to work on this. But I think it is most important that we do continue to negotiate and get a deal on ethics and illicit finance, one that, again, makes sure that we are protecting the public and that we do not allow corruption to grow. And that's not just the president and his family. That's all elected officials who are also included in that language.
Senator, thank you. It's good to have you back with us on Bloomberg. Democratic Senator Angela Alsobrooks of Maryland with us live from Capitol Hill. We turn to Wall Street, where it was a down day as a global tech sell-off rattled the markets. Chip stocks leading the way lower. Micron, my goodness, closing the day down more than 13% ahead of its earnings that will be out by this time tomorrow. For details, we turn to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who's back with us live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine?
Yeah, interesting backdrop heading into that earnings about 24 hours from now. All all of the drama started overseas in Korea overnight last night when there was a local media report that seemed to suggest that SK Hynix, one of the biggest memory chip makers in the world, a Korean company, was actually scaling back some of its growth with regards to these AI-related memory chips. Now, there's no confirmation that they're actually doing that. The company did not comment on that, but that sent the Kospi, the benchmark index over in Korea, down 10%. That then had a ripple effect here in the United States, where you saw the NASDAQ 100 drop about 3%. You saw the S&P 500 drop about 1.5%. The Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, which is made up of all the big U.S. chip makers, that was down about 8%. And we should point out there have been 16 trading days in the month of June. And on at least 8 of those trading days, we've seen the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index move up or down by 5% or more. That is volatility. In fact, the volatility that tracks chip stocks, it's called the VXN index, that's now almost at its highest level in about a year. And that is where we head into tomorrow when we hear from Micron, one of the best performing stocks so far this year, one of the best performing stocks, frankly, over the last year and a half. They are scheduled to report, and everyone wants to know, what is the growth story? Are they still selling? Do they still have pricing power? And is the main narrative around this AI growth trade that has powered stocks to record high after record high still intact? Those earnings scheduled to hit the tape at some point around 4 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow.
And we'll be looking forward to your coverage on the close. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostic, thank you so much. And still ahead here on Balance of Power, fresh reaction to the president's remarks in Pennsylvania and his comments on the timeline of potential nuclear inspections in Iran when Republican Senator Roger Marshall of Kansas joins us next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
They're wrong. They told us inside, and we have it down 100% inspections. And if they were right, I'd cancel the meetings right now.
When will those, from your view, Mr. President, when will those inspectors actually be on the ground?
At the appropriate time. At the appropriate time. There's no rush, but they'll be on the ground at the appropriate time.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kaylee Lyons. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We heard from President Trump there earlier today commenting on the state of talks with Iran and the sticking point, as highlighted by the U.S., that Iran would allow nuclear inspectors into the country. This back and forth continues. And joining us now is Republican Senator Roger Marshall of Kansas, member of the Senate Budget Finance Committees. Senator, it's great to have you back. You, of course, are a veteran. You served in the military. And so I'm curious your thoughts on the president's posture here. No rush to get inspectors into Iran, even after the administration suggested that there was an imminent threat, an imminent nuclear threat that provoked this war. Should we be more conscious of timing here and get inspectors on the ground now?
Well, Joe, I don't know that I feel an alarm because of that situation. For the first time ever, Iran has agreed not to develop any further nuclear weapons. I think the exciting story here to me is this concept of taking swords and then turning into plow shields. That's exactly what happened with President Reagan and the USSR. They took 500 tons of enriched uranium and they downblended that and turned it into nuclear energy. We only have a half a ton to deal with there. Hopefully it's in a safe place and safe containers. So I think this is very doable. The first step, again, will be to downblend it there with American inspectors, we hope. So in due time, I guess I don't feel a panic about it today.
Well, if that is something that's going to come down the road, Iran is already getting financial relief now. Senator, we saw the waiver of sanctions for its energy products, which it's now free to sell on the global market. Iran says $12 billion in frozen funds are going to be unfrozen. The president maintains that those unfrozen funds will be used to buy U.S. agricultural products, and Iran says they can use it however they want. Should any money be unfrozen if we can't guarantee how Iran will use it?
Look, I think that this is the first step. In order to get Iran to sign that agreement for no more nuclear weapon development, no future enrichment, we had to give something. I would gladly give $5 billion, $12 billion of their own money. Again, this is not American money. This is not Obama sending over $1.7 billion. Yes, I hope that they use it to buy beef from Kansas, but time will tell. Again, I think there has to be some trust in the process right now. Right now, the money we're releasing, the sanction money will be used for humanitarian purposes. Our farmers bore a large brunt of the situation there in Iran with high diesel prices and high fertilizer prices. So again, I remain hopeful.
The president called out farmers today in his speech in Pennsylvania for this very reason, Senator. And I'm just curious, with regard to farmers in your state, we had talked about potential federal assistance last time you joined us. If the president doesn't sell soybeans to Tehran, will there need to be a farm bailout before the end of this year?
I think even if we do sell $5 billion worth of food to Iran, we're going to still have to help the farmers out. And again, this president's done more for the American farmer than any other presidency. We've given them $65 billion for crop insurance, $40-some billion for farm aid already. But the input costs continue to be exorbitant. And despite our exports being up, it's still tough times. I'm afraid we're going to have to go back to the well one more time here.
Wow.
Well, Senator, I'd also like to ask you, and maybe you plan to raise this in the lunch that President Trump will be attending with you and your colleagues on Capitol Hill tomorrow. I would imagine he's more focused on issues like the filibuster and trying to pass the Save America Act, which the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, suggests is not something that's passable. The filibuster right now is not killable. Who's wrong, the Majority Leader or the President?
Yeah, I'm sorry, you kind of cut out. Here's my take on the situation right now. Look, John Thune would love to pass the SAVE Act. There's at least 50 Republicans that believe that we should have IDs when you show up to vote, that you should have proof of citizenship. The leader is on board with that. I'm on board with that. But
what about mail-in ballot restrictions?
Yeah, well, I would love to limit the mail-in ballot restrictions. I would love not have just automatic ballots to go out. I think that's actually the biggest problem here we're facing. But regardless, we're never going to get a Democrat vote for any type of security for elections right now. So we would have to bypass the filibuster, and that's what we don't have the votes for. It would take 60 votes, what you're describing to do, whether it's mail-in ballots or voter ID, any of that would take 60 votes unless we eliminate the filibuster. And I bet a third of our caucus is not willing to do that. I am. I wasn't there a year or two ago, but now that the Democrats have been such a big obstructionist, I'm now willing to consider doing that.
What's the president in for tomorrow, Senator? You read all the same reporting that we're reading, that he's going to get an earful, that rank and file senators are ready to stand up and crow about things like the Save America Acts, like Bill Pulte as DNI holding up the renewal of FISA 702. Is this going to be a happy visit? Is he going to get an earful from John Cornyn?
Oh, I don't know if anyone's going to get an earful. I think that this is a business deal. This is a business deal going down. And no, you've been part of a church board or a business board. I've been on a hospital board with the doctors that were yelling and screaming at each other. But at the end of the day, we walked out of there. We're still friends. We want to take good care of our patients. There are some grievances, but I think this is good. I think it's good to sit down and say, here's our concerns right now. What can we do to get on the same page? I think that there's going to be a discussion of the Save America Act. Again, if I could pass one bill the rest of my career, this would be it. I think that election integrity is that important. But then we need to move on. We got to discuss what is possible. Are we going to do a reconciliation 3.0 bill? I look forward to hearing a little more discussion on the Iran agreement, where that's going as well. Guess what? We got an election in November. We need to be focused on bringing down the cost of gas and groceries, which is exactly what this memorandum does as well. We need to stay focused on the prosperity and the security of the American people, and we'll get there.
Okay. All right. Senator Roger Marshall, the Republican from Kansas, thank you so much for joining us on Balance of Power. And still ahead, we'll turn to the primaries being held today, including in New York. More next on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. We're just hours away from the polls closing in New York in one of the most boisterous primary seasons it's seen in years, with crowded Democratic contests in a number of congressional districts pitting the moderate and progressive wings of the party against one another, as evidenced by Mayor Zohar Mamdani's backing of anti-establishment candidates. For more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Bill Faries, who is covering all things primaries and midterms for us. So, Bill, there's any number of races, frankly, that we could look at today. The Mamdani-centered ones seem to be in a few districts, in the 10th and 13th, for example, where he's going against the incumbent candidates, trying to get more socialist-aligned folks in with him in New York City. What kind of test of his political power is this going to be?
Well, the big test is going to be, are all those voters who came out for Mamdani a year ago, and really, remember, he started at 1 or 2% in the polls. Are they going to show up for these anti-establishment candidates? Are they going to toss out some of these incumbents who have the backing of establishment figures like Hakeem Jeffries? It looks like the early signals are that this voter cohort this year is a little bit older. It's not quite the much younger crowd that we saw that took Mamdani to power. So that's going to be the real test. And it will be, a sign of whether the Democratic Socialists really can carry their message beyond the mayor's house and into the halls of Congress.
Really interesting. Mamdani has chosen a challenger to oust the chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. There are some pretty wild races to watch here, none getting more attention than the 12th Congressional District. If you don't know where that is, and you think of Manhattan, think of Central Park down to about the Flatiron. This is the heart of Midtown. And it's being called the clown car because there are so many candidates. And, Bill, a lot of them are pretty well known. Jack Schlossberg of the Kennedy clan, George Conway of cable news fame. Where's this going to break with such noisy polling?
Yeah, it's a five-way race. The polling has been all over the board. You've got a state assemblyman, Alex Boris, in there, too, who has drawn a lot of attention for his positions on artificial intelligence. And you have, if there's a fight within the fight, it's the AI companies supporting Boris or opposing him. $28 million has gone into that race.
Wow.
An incredible amount for a seat that will remain Democratic when we go to November. That's the thing about a lot of these New York races.
This is the general.
Right.
Yeah, this is effectively the general election today in a lot of these key battles.
Well, not everywhere, though. The city is one thing. The suburbs are another, especially in the district currently being represented by Republican Congressman Mike Lawler. What Democrat is going to be the one going up against him in November, does it seem?
That's a case study. That is seen as one of the most vulnerable districts in all of the November elections this year. Democrats feel like they never should have lost that seat. They won it back very badly. This will be a battle between a couple more moderate candidates and a couple more progressive candidates, a real test of who Democratic voters think is best positioned to take that seat back.
He's no dummy, though, and not just a member of Congress. He was a political operative. He was a campaign manager at one point in his career. Is Lawler himself steering the strategy here?
He knows what he's doing here. He won that district.
Yeah.
He won it from the Democrats for a good reason. He gets criticized for his opponents for being too pro-Trump. The reality is he has distanced himself from Trump when and where he really thinks he needs to benefit his voters. So he is hard to pin down on that front.
Yeah.
But I think in the end, Democrats say that's a seat that they think they should have, they should never have lost, and they want that person voting for a Democratic speaker in November.
Well, he likes the Mr. Salt moniker that the president claims he gave him, even though I think I still started that, Kaylee. Bill Faries, I love that you're on the primaries. Thanks for joining us here. Let's compare notes on results tomorrow. There's one policy area both Democrats and Republicans are hopeful could help them in the general this November. We've already mentioned it this hour. That's housing. After the Senate last night passed the 21st Century Road to Housing Act, as it's called, in a rare bipartisan vote, the bill now makes its way to the House for final passage in what could be one of the last, if not the last, major policy bipartisan law to come out of this Congress before the midterms. And for more on this and a lot of other issues, we're joined by Democratic Congresswoman Sydney Kamlager-Dove of California, a member of the House Foreign Affairs and House Judiciary Committees. Congresswoman, it's good to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg. Do you have a sense on timing for this vote? And are you a yes?
So
So first of all, it's good to be here with both of you, Joe and Kayleigh. I do not have a sense of when this is going to come before the House. I will have to say that the cost of everything is getting more expensive, and Democrats really did fight hard to ensure that this would be a bipartisan bill and there would be something in it for homeowners and for renters, and that's incredibly important. But it's also important to remember that we have a president that thinks $3.99 for a gallon of gas is affordable. I'm in a state where gas is upwards of $6.50. And so we have to keep talking about ways that we can bring down the cost of living and ensure that there's more affordable housing that is being built. So I don't know when we're going to see it before the House. We haven't really gotten a clean schedule, but I hope to be a yes. And as you mentioned, it is really important that we are focusing in a bipartisan area on these kinds of issues, while recognizing that this president doesn't seem to think that folks are weathering the storms of this economic freefall that we're in.
Well, the president does seem to recognize the difficulty of higher gas prices. While he has repeatedly said he actually thought that they and oil prices would go even higher due to the conflict with Iran, he is now pursuing a deal that has seen the reopening already of the Strait of Hormuz and is bringing gas prices lower. Is he not doing the right thing, Congresswoman?
Well, that's a funny thing. First of all, we do know that 13 servicemen and women have died in this war. We know that it has cost an estimated $100 billion that Americans probably would like to see go to their health care and to really help them subsidize their housing and their gas costs. I'd also say the deal is definitely pretty slippery. If there was a deal, they wouldn't still be there negotiating. And Americans want to know when this war is going to end. How can we be sure that the Strait of Hormuz is going to stay open? And how can we ensure that we're going to keep Americans safe? As I mentioned, I'm still going to the gas station and the pump says $6.50 a gas, and it hasn't gone down.
You're on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. We're in the throes of a very pivotal and important series of negotiations with Iran, Congresswoman. Are you hearing anything from the administration in terms of status updates, progress that's being made? Because we're hearing conflicting reports from both sides of the table. Is your ranking member, is Leader Meeks hearing anything that he can share with you that you can tell us tonight?
You know, Joe, I think we're in the same boat. We're getting so much conflicting information. They're having negotiations, and then the Iranians are leaving the table. What's this about $350 billion that they might have access to? The strait was closed, then it was open, and it's closed again. Only a couple boats are going through. We need real answers, and we also need real transparency. I have to tell you, when Biden was in office and the Republicans were in the majority, we had almost weekly a hearing on the withdrawal of Afghanistan. We have had 0 committee hearings on this war, and we're still in it. And I think the American people, let alone the ranking member, deserve answers. We need to be able to hold this administration accountable, and the American people want to know when this is going to end.
Well, as you consider the notion of members of the administration having to appear before Congress, I know you don't necessarily have a seat on the Appropriations Committee, but you may very well soon have to decide whether or not to vote for a supplemental funding package to backfill the Pentagon's munitions stockpiles, given everything that was expended in this conflict while it was ongoing. Are you prepared to do that, as the Pentagon is warning later this summer it could run out of funds?
I think Pete Hegseth needs to come to these committee hearings a few more times. Even Republicans have questions about his ask, and we're starting to hear frustrations from across the aisle about how much money they're asking for and what it will be used for. You know, we would not have a depletion of munitions if we were not involved in wars and conflicts like this, once again, without real information or accountability or transparency. So I'm not prepared to write another blank check to this secretary without getting some answers from him. And I think the American people have the same questions that I'm asking.
You mentioned gas prices. Congresswoman, you're down to $5.56 on average in California, which I believe remains the most expensive in the country. And I'm sure, to your point, a lot of people are paying a lot more than that. That's the average price. When we were in Los Angeles for the Milken conference, it was $7 and $8 in some extreme cases. What's going to happen with this whole idea of suspending the federal gas tax? Has that been forgotten?
I don't think it's been forgotten, but I think Americans just want answers from this administration about how he is going to help them afford to live. And I will tell you something.
Is that
you
one
just
way?
talked about no. I think it's a conversation. I'm so sorry.
Eliminating the gas taxes. I'm sorry, I don't mean to step on you.
No, it's quite all right. I mean, I think that's up for debate. You know, in California, we also pay an additional tax, and I know that that is hard on people. But I also know that I have constituents who are going to fill up the gas tank, and they're saying, I don't know if I can afford to fill this up and also pay for groceries. I do think we have to have real conversations about alleviating some of the gas taxes that many Americans are having to pay. But the larger issue is the gas prices should be going down.
Well, and we appreciate you reflecting on that with the conversations you're having with constituents at home. I also wonder, Congresswoman, about the conversations you had recently on your trip to Brussels, specifically as it pertains to the war between Russia and Ukraine. As we saw the president at the G7 summit in France last week suggest he would like to shift his focus and attention to ending that conflict. The NATO Secretary General is going to be meeting with President Trump at the White House tomorrow. Does Mark Rutte, do our European allies have reason to be more optimistic about the U.S.'s desire to support Ukraine and end the war?
Well, I just came back, as you mentioned, and I was there to remind our NATO allies that the United States is still in the game as it relates to climate. But I have to tell you, I did a lot of listening, and they're concerned about our reliability as a partner. They talked about us pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. They talked about us possibly trying to steal Greenland. They talked about us threatening to withdraw from NATO, and they wondered how honest we're being with them about wanting to support Ukraine. Now, I will say right before we left for the break, there was a bipartisan vote that passed. Congress said we want to impose greater sanctions on Russia, and we also support giving more funding to fight this Ukrainian war. We're getting ready to celebrate 250 years, the birthday of this country, which is all about our independence and our sovereignty. And I think that Ukraine deserves that as well. So I hope that he comes and has a real conversation with this administration and echoes the same concerns that they shared with us.
Joe Biden used to tell a story about his first G7 as president, and his message was, America is back. You've heard this, and what he heard back was, but for how long? With the anecdote that you just shared, Congresswoman, and the concerns that our allies, as you said, expressed to us, what was your answer? Wait 2 years?
No, I was there to let them know that while they might be hearing from this administration, that Congress is also very important and we're in the game. I mean, we have the ability to authorize a war, we have the power of the purse, and we have the ability to conduct oversight. And regardless of what administration is in power, Congress will still be here. We certainly told them that, and we reiterated that we are committed to NATO. I mean, I'm a member that's on the NATO PA, so I'm very committed to making sure that they know that we want to remain relevant and that we will be reliable. But that's also a message that this administration needs to hear from our European allies.
All right, Congresswoman, thank you for joining us. Democratic Congresswoman Sidney Kamlager-Dove of California. We appreciate it. And up next, reflecting pool renovations reach a new phase. Why the promised upgrade from the president is taking longer and longer, and who he's now blaming for it. Up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. In tonight's Power Brief, today the UK marks exactly 10 years since Brexit, an event that ushered in a decade of political turmoil that has seen 6 prime ministers come and go, capped by the resignation announcement yesterday of Keir Starmer. And Andy Burnham, of course, now looking set to replace him as Britain's Labour Party takes stock and several potential challengers to Burnham step aside and pave the way for a speedy path for him to go to 10 Downing Street.
He lasted longer than a head of lettuce. The president now says 6 people have been arrested for allegedly damaging the reflecting pool. We have an update on the reflecting pool. This follows the renovation that has cost millions of dollars. Word of those arrests coming as we learn the pool will not be reopened in time for the country's 250th birthday. 4th of July with the national landmark plagued by algae peeling paint following the president's own orders. President Trump blaming vandalism for the delays, failing conditions of the pool, but has offered no evidence to back up those claims.
And Iran's World Cup team will now be allowed to stay in the U.S. a day ahead of its third match on Friday. The Department of Homeland Security is changing its guidelines for the team as talks between the U.S. and Iran progress. Meanwhile, we're learning the president will officially hand over the World Cup trophy to the winner at the game's final next month. FIFA President Gianni Infantino, who has paid multiple visits to the Oval Office during Trump's second term, made the announcement today, saying he would be presenting alongside Trump. Late last year, the president, of course, represented the USA when pulling the U.S. draw in the World Cup, hosting the FIFA event at the Kennedy Center. The World Cup final match is slated for July 19th.
I'm just going to throw another log on this fire with the headline now that President Trump is expected to sign the housing bill, assuming that's passed later in the House, as we discussed with the Congresswoman, in the Capitol tomorrow morning. He's going to be going there to meet with senators. So this could be quite a show. That's according to reports just coming into the newsroom here. Joining us now, our political panel. Adam Hodge is with us, managing director at Bully Pulpit International, our Democratic strategist alongside Republican strategist Sarah Chamberlain, the president and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership. It's great to have both of you with us. This is always a great panel, so let's get started here. Adam, I'll start with you on matters of Iran. As the former spokesperson for the National Security Council in the Biden administration, we're hearing wildly different versions about what is in this deal, having to do with weapons inspectors, having to do with the missile program. Who are you listening to for the truth?
I'm not listening to the Trump administration.
So Iran is more trustworthy?
I think you don't know who to trust, and that has been the problem since February 28th, 2026, when this war started. The administration, from day one, set out clear objectives that they thought were a bit clear. Was it the nuclear weapons? Was it to start an uprising? Was it to get rid of the ballistic missiles? And they've shifted their story every single day almost in the last 2.5 months, almost 100 days, sorry. And so I think the problem with that the president has had, and remember, he gave that speech to Congress where he also muddied the message about what this was really all about. It has been thick and as clear as mud since this war has started. And the American people are still paying for it. Gas is $1 more a gallon than it was when the war started. As the Congresswoman alluded to, 13 service members are dead. And you have not seen a clear articulation of how this actually makes us safer. Iran has fleeced us in this deal. They're going to get hundreds of billions of dollars. Sanctions are off the table. It's an unquestionable win for the Iranians since this war started.
Of course, the deal isn't final yet. We're still in the negotiating period. And even though we are in the negotiating period, we just saw the United States Senate vote to pass the war powers resolution that the House already did, ordering the U.S. to stop hostilities in Iran. We're saying this is symbolic, but is it a warning to the president about Republicans' increasing willingness to break with him?
It is, because they are increasingly willing to break with him. You've got a few that are going to be retired, whether they've chosen to be retired or whether his candidates beat them in the primaries. So that's why he's going there tomorrow, to have lunch with them, to try to schmooze things over.
Is he going to get an earful, or are they going to get an earful?
I think it's going to be both, to be honest. I think it's going to go both ways, which would be a very interesting discussion. And I think it's long overdue, to be honest. Yeah. So I can't wait to talk to Senator Thune after this.
Oh, my God.
And see how it all goes down.
I'm sure they're going to have questions about whether Bill Pulte actually is going to be the nominee. I mean, there's all kinds of sort of thorns in the Republican Senate caucus that they really are have real problems with the president. They're starting to show up, but the question is when it comes down to the actual votes, when it comes down to the actual policy, are they going to buck the president?
What did you make of that war powers vote today?
4 of them did, and then a Democrat joined the Republicans.
Look, the president's going to veto this. This is a little bit of atmosphere.
It also had something to do with attendance.
But the real question will come down to on the funding. Are we going to give the Pentagon billions more dollars to replenish the stocks to pay for a war that should not have happened in the first place? That will be the tougher vote, and that will be, I think, where to watch where Republicans stand.
Well, weigh in on that, Sarah, because we're talking about kind of a two-part strategy here, getting some money through supplemental funding and potentially some from a reconciliation package aside from the regular appropriations process. Are they going to get any of it?
The reconciliation they could get. I mean, this is going to be a discussion, which is one of the reasons why I think President Trump is coming tomorrow. He doesn't have the votes yet for all of this money. We support the men and women in the military. They are amazing. We have the best military in the world. But where does the expenses end here? I mean, that's going to be a big discussion point, and especially going into a midterm election.
Well, if you eliminate reconciliation and supplemental, you're back down to $1 trillion, basically a little bit over $1 trillion, which would pretty much be flat from where we are now. Would Democrats support that?
I think what you're going to hear from Democrats is we're spending all this money when we could be spending on health care. We could be spending on things that make other costs more affordable.
We've got a lot of munitions to replace as well.
We do, but again, I think the Democrats will feel like, and do feel like, they are on stronger footing on this war on national security and tying it back to the affordability and economic argument. That, to me, feel like the most powerful punch that Democrats can weigh. You shouldn't have done this war in the first place. Now you want us to pay almost $1 trillion more for a war that never should have started while people can't get health care, while they can't put food on the table. I'm sorry. I will take that. Democrats will run with that for the next couple months. Well, of course,
the president was talking about affordability on a trip to Pennsylvania today in the district of a vulnerable Republican in a swing seat, Ryan McKenzie. Is it helpful for swing seat Republicans for President Trump to be out there on the road?
So for full disclosure, he is a member of the Republican Main Street Partnership, so I know him very well. Trump would pull out the base, which would be helpful for him, and then Ryan will give his own messaging for the rest of the district. He barely won it. It was very close, and we have great confidence he's going to be reelected in November.
And Democrats are going to cut the ads of the president standing next to that member of Congress and put, thousands and thousands of points on that ad to try to tower him and tie him to the president, because I think it's a weakness.
We're a lot of us living near places like New York, Maryland, Utah are really looking forward to not seeing ads every 5 seconds. It's primary day. Bring us to New York. We've got this wild clown car primary in the 12th district, with all due respect to some of the folks there, and a Mamdani endorsement, 3 over on the line this evening. How important will the mayor be in these?
Well, I was just some would say, with all due respect to clowns, but look, I think that the Mamdani, it's interesting, right? Like, for mayors, and if you've got this political capital, it doesn't do any good sitting in a vault. You got to spend it.
Partners in Washington,
and so, like, full credit to him. Now, it may. I think it'd be a little bit more of a muddied picture as to what happens tonight. But I think as much drama that unfolds in New York, all of this will do nothing to sway the balance of the House. And that is truly what matters. I think Democrats are on offense. I think across the country, we are in well positioned to win some of these battleground states, and that's what I think you'll see.
Well, Adam, I actually don't agree with you. I think it does change the House, because you're going to get more potentially really left-winging people in there, which I think would be hard if you do get the majority to control them. I'm kind of happy to see the Democrats in a party fight. We've been having it for a while.
You're popping the corn tonight.
I am. And the Democrats don't have any money either. So it's like, okay, this is good for us.
In our final 30 seconds, take Mike Lawler's district. What kind of Democrat does he want to be running against?
He wants to run against the far left. It's an extremist. We'll see which one wins tonight.
Do you buy the line that he's one of the most vulnerable members in the House? You don't?
No, there's more than one. He's tough. He knows how to win. There are a few more that I put ahead of him.
Just real quick, on some of these swing states, some of these swing districts, what you've seen the party do is actually elect more moderate, more midstream candidates. I think that's what you'll see across the country.
We'll see tonight.
Stay tuned. Polls close at 9 p.m.
Yeah, let's do it.
And we'll, of course, have full analysis for you. Sarah Chamberlain and Adam Hodge, thank you so much. And, of course, for more on all of these primaries, all things Washington, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Love this panel. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.